if you drive a few hours north of here, you'll get to a province called Mpumalanga. In Mpumalanga, there are two huge power stations that the South African government has recently completed. One of them is called Kusikle, and in the community next to Kusikle, there are people who have to wake up every morning to the smell of toxic fumes. There are people who have been moved to that area during apartheid and who still live there now because for the past 30 years, my government has been prioritizing economic growth. My government has been prioritizing coal power, and people are suffering. When I go home from this competition, there is a high likelihood that I won't be able to turn the lights on. But let's not focus on me. There are millions in townships across my country who aren't able to put food on the table because my government put economic growth over climate change prioritization, and that's what this debate is really about. So to get into some strategic flaws that I've noticed with opposition's case so far, firstly note their heavy reliance on individual examples, which we think is just like not right. Even if we win this debate just on China or just on America, it is wider than that. And note they tell you it's about all UN nations, and then they make this debate really small, only like engaging with individual examples that like my first speaker brought up. But furthermore, note how vague their analysis has been as to what prioritizing economic growth looks like. We gave you a three-part policy. We told you firstly we're going to prioritize climate change on an economic front, which is like investing in renewables, and like this will look different for every country. I'll address that now, but overall you can picture that, right? Secondly, it's on a social level in terms of boosting education and allowing climate groups to be more active in society. And thirdly, it's on a diplomatic level, only doing trade deals and only joining organizations which have a general like sense of climate friendliness. But they give us no analysis as to how their prioritization of economic growth is actually going to work, which is really harmful when they mention things like, oh, if we just prioritize economic growth, gun violence will go down. There's zero link in their panel, and you need to note that. Just because you prioritize economic growth doesn't mean you magically get benefits of education or gun violence, and you can see that in South Africa. On the streets right now, our government has supposedly been prioritizing economic growth for the past 30 years, and it's done nothing. But note a really important part of this debate that opposition has to engage with going forward is that prioritization looks different in different countries. We can't expect the Maldives or Mozambique to have the same like level of climate emphasis as America, but that doesn't mean they can't prioritize it in their own sense. The way America prioritizes something will be on a very large scale. The way a developing country prioritizes something might be smaller. What we're focused on is we think prioritization is when an individual country puts the most of their resources towards that thing. If they have less resources, that's fine, we're good with that, as long as it is their priority over economic growth. Like in terms of their education thing, just that quick thing on the POI, they talk about how education has failed in the status quo. Note the concession they make there, because in the status quo, economic growth is being prioritized. So the reason that education is failing is because we aren't prioritizing it enough. So we think that's a pretty fatal concession they make there. And then just to wrap up the principal clash panel, we think that they like gave very little response to it other than like, oh, governments have a duty to their citizens and they should like put that first over duty to all humans. We agree with that, and we literally gave you a point on how combating climate change is fulfilling your duty to citizens, because there are real impacts that every citizen faces from things like emissions, from things like rising sea levels. So we don't think you're winning that clash. So to weigh it up at the halfway mark, we're winning on principle because they've engaged very little with my first speaker's matter on the obligation government has to its citizens and the obligation it has to global citizens. But then we're also going to be winning on efficacy here because we haven't seen much from them, and my speech will largely focus on that clash. So going into my point then, it's called The Pie Grows but the Slices Don't, and it will seek to explain how economic growth offers limited benefits where the fight against climate change has significant impact on countries. Three things I'll be proving essentially. Firstly, economic growth is seldom viable, and when it is viable, it's actually not that needed. Secondly, economic growth is actually often harmful. And thirdly, climate change, like fighting against climate change uplifts the weaker in our society. The importance of this point is winning us the efficacy clash. Note we're already ahead on principle. This wins us really the kind of hard, concrete impact side of the debate. Going into actors, we have to realize this is a debate of two worlds. Firstly, of developing countries, I'll take you off my actors analysis. Developing countries, we're looking at countries that have heavy inequality. This is likely due to colonialism, civil strife and historic oppression, apartheid in South Africa, loads of countries across Africa with colonialism. That causes a massive split, right? Because you have the old ruling class of the country, you have the people who were previously rich, and then you have the vast majority of a population which is poorer, and there's a huge wealth gap. right there. Secondly, you have the resource curse in a lot of these developing countries. That's where a country has the resources, but due to them not having the material to extract that resources, they have to call in Western or Chinese companies to like get that resource extracted. And what that leads to is the West and China and Russia getting the benefits of these resources, but these countries like the Congo, like Mali, being left in the dust despite their massive amounts of oil reserves. Furthermore, we think corruption is pretty bad in these countries. We think that is a significant note. And also a lot of these countries across Africa and South America are relying on big foreign powers like Russia and China for a lot of their aid. And often these countries have harmful environmental policies. Now let's go to developed countries before I take your POI, and we're looking specifically at countries that already have economic prosperity. And this is key to note, panel, because when you already have economic prosperity, it's highly likely that you're already able to uplift a basic level of human rights in your country. When we're looking at America, the UK, Denmark, most of Europe, these countries do not have huge human rights issues, and so we think that prioritizing economic growth is not a massively significant thing, but climate change is. I'll deal with that in my point. Furthermore, we think these developed countries are the massive contributors to climate change. Your POI.
How does the government respond to the fact that all countries are at different points in their development? You cannot mandate one priority for the entire world.
So firstly, we're not mandating it because this house is not like the UN or whatever, but furthermore, I told you this prioritization looks different. So if a country is further back on the development track, they would prioritize it in a less developed way than a different country. So we think it's fine to ask them all to prioritize it, but we're acknowledging that that level of prioritization will look different. Okay, so going into the first part, the idea that this economic growth is seldom viable and seldom needed. In the case of developing countries, we think it's seldom viable because this economic growth often offers little rewards. Because that means when you begin to prioritize economic growth, you're relying on foreign companies, you're enabling the resource curse, and you're relying on Russia and China to give you that economic growth. Note this is what happens across Africa, this is what BRICS looks like, it's the Belt and Road Initiative with China, where they massively invest in these poorer countries because these countries want economic growth, but the poorest citizens in these countries see literally no change. But note in developed countries, that economic growth might be viable because they don't have the inequality and corruption, but we don't think it's needed. We think that in order to help the weakest, you don't need to prioritize economic growth, you just need to invest a bit more in welfare. We think actually economic growth prioritization in Western countries looks like allowing big business just to take over, and that's often harmful on the weakest in these countries. So we don't think that in either case it's either viable or needed, and note the significance of this panel, because it shows that their side, even if we can't prove that climate change needs to be prioritized, it means they're certainly losing because they can't prove that economic growth needs to be prioritized. But now why is economic growth significantly harmful? Not only are the problems not solved in these countries, but furthermore, we think it creates knock-on harms. We think it creates harms on people, and that's just fundamentally when you allow big businesses to exploit in these countries, you get people hurt. When you allow them to go crazy on harming the climate, that has knock-on impacts. It also harms diplomacy. Note that panel. When you allow African countries just to run into the arms of Russia and China, we think that is particularly harmful to the people in those countries. So now to finish off, why is climate change particularly beneficial? Why is it prioritized over this terribly harmful thing of economic growth? Firstly, we tell you it boosts small businesses because in these developing countries, the smaller businesses are the ones who invest in renewables. The big companies, the state-owned companies, are the ones who have historically invested in these fossil fuels, whereas small businesses uplift the poorest in society. Secondly, we tell you it reduces the short-term impacts of climate change. Note when you're literally pumping emissions into the air, when you have litter on your beaches, that has real human harms, particularly on the poorest, who tend to live in these areas due to things like redlining, due to things like previous oppression. So we're helping those people most importantly. But note this also helps in the developed countries, right? We say it encourages renewables, which means that big gas and big oil have less influence. So we're better in developing, and economic growth certainly doesn't help. This is the best for the world. That's why you side with opposition. Propositions, rather.
That was line 13, thank you.